Welcome, everyone. So happy to be here at our summer virtual meeting. This meeting is particularly aligned with our values today because this is a carbon net zero meeting. Versus when we fly to a conference in October, it will be it will be either a carbon expenditure for us as a group or a carbon neutral meeting. And to make it a carbon neutral meeting, we can pay for carbon offsets. So there are many societies that are starting to add that to the registration for your Make It Optional. So when council meets next month, we'll be suggesting to you how ABMR moves forward. And of course, carbon net zero is phenomenally more important and impactful than carbon neutral because companies can burn all the carbon they want and pay for our offsets. Okay, so our October meeting in person, we've had some changes. Bonnie Kaplan from Canada, who is older, is not going to be able to come and really wants to share with our community. She studies nutrition and mental health and interventions for depression using nutrition. And she has a new popular book out. So we would like to consider doing a virtual meeting with her in 2022. I think it's very relevant work for our behavioral medicine community. In her place, we will have a keynote from Richie Davidson. Instead of a talking head, we're going to have an experiential hour with different types of reflections and meditations. We've also have a new keynote from Steve Horvath. The theme of the meeting is optimizing longevity. It's a funny topic in 2021, but we will talk about and add an aspect of also how we can age in attunement with the earth as well. We won't be talking about the things that you might hear from Dave Asprey, et cetera, on ketogenic diets. We are looking for someone to help co-lead the 10 early stage investigator mentoring and leadership training. Tika Hall was going to lead that. So that brings us to Tika. And I would like to say we're very moved by all the donations coming in for the Tika Hall Mentoring Award. Tika is in hospice at home. She's no longer in communication. She is checking the website, as far as I know, that they've set up for her through Caring Bridge. So we will be sending her a note on Monday telling her that the Tika Hall Mentoring Award was funded. Right now it's funded at about 40%. If we can get to 25,000, we can have it last for 10 years. This is an award to both reward our colleagues for mentoring, but also to bring an underrepresented minority early stage investigator to ABMR. And we know how influential that all of that kind of networking and group mentoring can be. So this is a change mechanism for us as a society. I hope you can, if you are able to, can give generously. So we need about 15,000 more, just to be blunt. Okay, so Richard Lane, thank you so much for interviewing Tika. There's a legacy interview with Tika Hall on our website, and there will not be a dry eye. It's phenomenal. She talks about how life affirming her last stage of life is with so many of the awards that she'll be acknowledged from, and how her legacy will live on, and how much appreciation and love, and what matters most to her is these relationships. So it's a beautiful interview. I encourage you to take a look at it. The goodbye call with her is also on the website. ABMR elections. Paige Green, we would not survive without you. I'm so glad you could join us today. Paige has been the secretary of ABMR. She's why I joined as president, and she has finalized the slate, the election slate, and the council has approved it. You will get the list of our new council and new president-elects next week. So please look out for that email. Okay, next I would like to, if I forgot anything, my council members, please put it in the chat. I'd like to move to introducing Lorraine Whitmarsh, our first speaker. We are so blessed to be with two world experts in climate and psychological mechanisms. And you are so busy and so sought after, and this is a small meeting, and we really appreciate you joining us. Lorraine is a professor at University of Bath. She is an environmental psychologist, a world authority on low carbon behavior change and habit change, government advisor, and one of the lead authors for the IPCC's 6th assessment report. Please look at her website for just an amazing program of research, which she'll tell us at a summary of it. 15 minutes talk, 15 minutes discussion. I know our group loves discussion, so we're doing 50% here. Lorraine, welcome. You can put your questions in the chat and I'll ask you to come on live during the question period, or I'll read it if you prefer.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Thanks very much, everybody, for being here, and a very generous introduction, and I hope I can do it justice. So I have only 15 minutes, and so I'm going to try and kind of give an overview of the sort of work that I do around behaviour change to address climate change, and particularly to mitigate climate change, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I just want to kind of start off by making the point, which may be obvious to everybody here, but is not always obvious to policy makers and decision makers around climate change, that actually behaviour change is really critical for tackling climate change. This was made clear in previous IPCC reports, for example, the 1.5 degree report a couple of years ago, which really highlighted that we need a radical societal transformation in order to tackle climate change, and that behaviour change is a key part of that. In the UK as well, very recently, we've had some analysis by our official climate change advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, who basically quantified the amount of change or the type of change needed to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And they came up with this pie chart, which shows that while about 40% of what we need to get to net zero is technological primarily, the rest involves at least some degree of social and behavioral change. So yeah, either a mixture of technological and behavioral change, or purely behavioral change. So actually altogether, the majority of what we need to get to net zero is involves some behavior change. And these are the sorts of things which specifically will need to change. So in terms of mitigating climate change, so reducing our emissions, we're talking about changing diets towards eating lower carbon diets, so more plant-based diets, less red meat and dairy particularly, and cutting food waste as well. And that accounts for something like a quarter of our carbon footprint. About another quarter comes from mobility, so our travel behaviours, and particularly here we need to cut down on flying and driving. We need to reduce our energy use in our homes and buildings, and so cut down on heating and cooling in particular. And we can do that through technologies, but also through various behaviour changes like reducing heating demand by turning down thermostats, for example. And of course, the bit that maybe we don't always remember is around material consumption. So the things that we buy, where there are embedded emissions, accounts for maybe a third of our carbon footprint. And we need to reduce that as well by buying things that last longer, by repairing and sharing things more, and so on. We also need to adapt to climate impacts, and there's a big behaviour change element of that as well. And we can divide that into behaviours which help us prepare for extreme weather events and climate impacts. So we can inform ourselves about what to do. We can buy equipment to protect our home. We can buy insurance and so on. And there are behaviours that we can take to when an impact has happened, either immediately following it or in the longer term. And so maybe we can evacuate an area, for example, or move away from an area altogether. So all of these things are different types of behaviours that we will need to change increasingly to address climate change. For most of my talk, I'll focus more on mitigation, but I think a lot of the insights probably apply broadly to adaptation as well. The first thing I wanted to also emphasise as well is around what we mean by behaviour change, whose behaviour is actually changing. And again, quite often there's an assumption by policymakers that we're talking about consumers. So we need to get people to buy greener products and maybe consume less energy at home. Those are really important things that people can do. They can consume in different ways and consume less of things. But we're not only consumers, we are also members of communities, we are parents, we are employees or employers. So we have a range of different roles, and in all of those different roles, we can exert influence. So we can either directly reduce our carbon footprint, or we can exert influence over processes and decisions and other people's behaviours in order to sort of change broader systems and structures. So I think it's important just to bear that in mind, that actually when we're talking about behaviour change, there are a lot of behaviours that we could potentially change at multiple different scales, from the individual through community, organisations, and up to the national and international level. And because we're really talking about such profound societal change when we're talking about tackling climate change, it's really crucial that we engage with people. So we don't just kind of try and change behaviour top down and just kind of implement interventions which change behaviour without engaging with and consulting people about that change, because it won't work. So we know from research on public acceptance of policies that actually perceived fairness is one of the strongest predictors of policy support. And that sense of fairness comes partly by being consulted. So actually it seems fairer if people are being listened to and they're part of the decision making about what sorts of policies we should have, how we should get to net zero. But it's also, there are other aspects of fairness around distribution, for example. So making sure that there aren't certain groups in society that are left behind by a transition to net zero. So we need to think about all these aspects of fairness, and engagement is really key to building that in. And we also know that actually more participatory policy making involving the public and the wider range of stakeholders tends to actually improve the quality of decision making as well. So that's the first thing, I think, is that we do need to involve the public. The good news is that actually public concern about climate change has been rising in recent years. So this is UK data, but actually US data is pretty consistent with this, that actually concern about climate change has risen really sharply in the last sort of 2 or 3 years. And 2019 really saw a very sharp increase. And now you might think, and I had assumed this at the start of the pandemic, that climate change concern would drop away as soon as COVID became a much more pressing issue for many people. And we'd seen this in the past, actually, that environmental concern had dropped during the financial crash, sort of 15 or so years ago. People just kind of were much more worried about jobs in the economy, and so environmental concern dropped away. We haven't seen that this time. It's really interesting that actually concern about climate change has either, depending on which poll you look at, has either kind of stayed pretty steady over the last year and a half, or maybe has even risen. So this is some data from our surveys over the last year and a bit, and actually the percentages saying that addressing climate change requires an extremely high level of urgency, or a high level of urgency, have actually increased since 2019. So this is really interesting. I think, public concern about climate change is now really, it's entrenched, it's widespread. So the public really is demanding action on climate change, although we know that their own behaviour change to a large extent kind of is lagging behind this. And there are lots of reasons for that. It can be very difficult to change behaviour even with the best will in the world. And so we need to remove the barriers to behaviour change, and we can do that through a number of different ways. So we can intervene, and there's different ways of categorising behaviour change interventions. This is just one way I quite like, into downstream and upstream interventions. Downstream are, broadly speaking, more informational type measures. So labelling, advertising, and maybe kind of social norm-based approaches as well could come into this category, where you're directly influencing people's choices and their attitudes and their knowledge, potentially. But it doesn't address the context, whereas upstream measures is about shaping the context of action. So it's about making things cheaper, more available, easier, etc. And so, you know, economic measures, physical infrastructure measures, regulatory measures, etc., would all kind of come into this category. The key thing is we need both downstream and upstream measures, and multiple upstream measures to effectively change behaviour. So let's just take a few specific examples. So what can information do? So this is in the downstream category. Information is really important because there are misperceptions that people have around climate change. So we can change those and we can inform people about what's effective action, for example. But it's not without its limitations. So we know, for example, that it can polarize opinion. In one study that we did some years ago, we gave people some information about climate change. We gave them 2 newspaper editorials. One presented a kind of quite skeptical view about climate change, and one presented a more sort of advocate position that we should take action to tackle climate change. So contrasting information. And we measured people's attitudes to climate change before and after reading this information. And we found that people that had, prior to reading the information, we'd considered to be skeptics, we categorized them according to their attitude as being skeptics, and they became significantly less convinced about climate change having read this information. Whereas the non-skeptics, people that believed in climate change, became a little bit more convinced. So there was some evidence that actually opinion polarized as a result of reading the same information. And this is broadly speaking what we see happening around climate change, is that although the skeptical voice is dying away a little bit, it is very difficult to convince people that are dubious about climate change to change their attitudes. And the reason for this, and I think Sandra will probably say more about this, is because there are various heuristics and biases that filter the information that we have about climate change. And so we need to adapt the way in which we frame information to take account of what people value and their beliefs and so on. And we can do that in different ways. We can segment our information to appeal to different audiences according to their values. And there are some framing studies that do this, where they try to market information or market products rather in different ways according to different types of consumers. This example was for some mineral water, where this was the control group. In this group, they emphasized that you would feel better having drunk this water, so a kind of personal benefit. And here they emphasized the environmental benefits by there being reduced landfill from less packaging. Okay. And so the same product marketed in different ways, and they found that the environmental benefit message appealed more to the green consumers, and the personal benefits message appealed to the less green consumers. And this is a well-known kind of marketing sort of strategy. Now, with climate change, of course, there actually are a lot of co-benefits. There are a lot of additional benefits to mitigating climate change. And health actually is one of the really big categories. So a low carbon diet tends to be much healthier. Low carbon travel, particularly active travel, walking, cycling, obviously much healthier. And so in studies where those sorts of health benefits, but other sort of immediate benefits like saving money, for example, have been emphasized, those type of messages tend to be more effective in general than emphasizing the environmental benefits of taking action. So I think we need to kind of frame information more effectively so that it resonates with audiences' values, and potentially highlighting those co-benefits is one way. But we also need to change the context of action, because what we know is that information alone tends not to be very effective in changing behaviour. And so just to take the example of transport behaviours, we know, for example, that they are very strongly shaped by the design of the urban environment. So whether there are cycle paths, whether it's attractive to walk through, safe, etc. And so physically redesigning cities so that we take road space away from cars and reallocate it to walking and cycling can be very effective in encouraging people out of cars and into more low carbon active modes. because it makes it obviously easier, more convenient to take those modes rather than to drive. So there was a meta-analysis some years ago that showed some very wide-ranging but generally pretty substantial changes in behaviour through that approach. And then, of course, there's other approaches like economic measures like congestion charging, which can help shift the incentives away from one mode to another. I just want to finish by talking about habits, because this is a big area that I'm interested in right now. And really the key thing here is that, as well as all of what I've just said about, targeting information in smarter ways, changing the context of action, we also need to think about when to intervene. And habits are one of the biggest barriers to behavior change. So, we tend to just do the same thing in a stable context. And so we will always travel to work in the same way without thinking about how to get there. And that means that it can be very difficult to change those behaviors because people just don't pay attention to information or maybe incentives about alternatives. But there are times when habits are weakened and disrupted by particular events. So they may be life events like moving house or starting a new job, starting a family, retiring. They may also be kind of wider, less biographical events and more kind of societal events. So an extreme weather event, for example, or even a pandemic, as we're starting to explore. In all of these cases, this significant disruption provides an opportunity to reshape people's habits. And in studies where interventions have been targeted at these so-called moments of change, they have tended to be much more effective. So this is from quite an old study now, but that's been replicated since then, where they gave, the researchers gave residents in a German city some information about the local bus service and a one-day pass to try the bus for free. And it was given a few weeks after a group of the residents had moved house. That's the relocated group, and a control group who had not recently moved house. So they were assumed to have more stable habits, whereas the relocated group had their habits disrupted. It was a time of disruption for them. And what they found was that this pretty low-cost intervention was very effective for the people that had recently moved house. It more than doubled bus use amongst that group, whereas there was no significant increase amongst the non-relocated group. And so the same intervention can work effectively amongst people whose habits have been disrupted versus not at all amongst people who have strong habits in existence. And what we've been doing recently is tracking how people's habits have been disrupted by COVID. And of course, we can all kind of relate to the fact that we've been traveling a lot less, but we've also found that people have been doing things differently in and around the home. So saving energy often, taking fewer showers, we found, saving food, cutting down on food waste. So being more frugal when it comes to thinking about food preparation, consuming less, buying less stuff, and taking up hobbies which tend to be lower carbon as well. So more gardening, more creative hobbies. And what's interesting is that a lot of people say that they want to continue doing at least some of these things, which is encouraging, but obviously we know intentions always translate into behaviour change. So really crucially, we need to lock these intentions in, these new habits in with appropriate infrastructure, with incentives, norms, etc., all the things I mentioned earlier. And so it's encouraging that we have this public concern about climate change as a backdrop and support for a lot of these sorts of policies that are needed to lock those in. So yeah, just to finish, I think I'm out of time. Radical behavioural change is important to reach net zero and to increase our resilience to climate impacts. We should be focusing on the high impact behaviours, the sorts of ones I mentioned earlier. We need to engage with people in terms of the design of the interventions to change behaviour, change society, and really focus our efforts around some of the wider co-benefits that will resonate with people's values, and that includes health benefits. And we need a combination of downstream and upstream interventions to remove the various barriers to behaviour change. And I think we really need to start to pay more attention to when we intervene as well. Getting the timing right is a really important insight, I think, into how we can be more effective in our interventions. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. She's written some masterful reviews for the field, one on habits and environmental change, some more in-depth view of what she just talked about. It's on our ABMR website. So I'd like to start with a question from Donald Edmondson. Donald, why don't you come live?
Oh, if I'd have known I was reading it, I wouldn't have typed so many of them. Sorry. So this is a great talk. I am a big fan of Lorraine's. Given the magnitude and pace of large-scale change we need, how important are efforts to convince remaining skeptics around climate action versus activating those who are already concerned or agree with the need for change? And my other two are sort of, do we believe that people who make behavioral changes are more likely to lobby the government or businesses for change? And is there any truth to the sort of activist argument that big oil and these other emitters want us to focus on our own behaviors so that we're feeling guilty and not pushing on them?
These are all brilliant questions, Don. Like, these are the really big questions, I think. So thank you for asking those. And I don't know if I can do them justice, but on the first one, I think, as I've kind of shown, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to actually convince skeptics about climate change. But I think the lessons there apply also to people who maybe are just not as interested in climate change as maybe some of us working in this field. And so that's really the majority of people. Actually, how can we motivate people to change their behavior? And often it's not really necessarily talking about climate change. It may be talking about, this is going to improve your well-being, this is going to improve your health, this is going to save you money. And so, you know, certainly for skeptics, but you know, to some extent, maybe the broader public, actually, we don't necessarily need to say too much about climate change in our messages. I think it's about emphasizing those wider co-benefits. There is a limit there because I think, you know, we do still need to adapt to climate impact. So I don't think we should lose the message about climate change altogether. But I think maybe just like emphasizing those things that we know are more likely to resonate with people within our messaging is more important. Yeah, do people that believe, do people that make personal behavior changes lobby government? So we've been interested in this idea of behavioral spillover for quite a while, which is that, you know, if you change one behavior, do you go on to change other behaviors? And so, you know, if you start saving energy at home, do you go on to changing your diet? Do you maybe even kind of lobby your MP, politician for change? And the evidence seems to be that generally not really. So there may be a pathway for some people where they kind of become more and more interested in this area, but actually the majority of people will see these behaviours in quite separate ways. And I think that does relate to the previous point, which is that actually it also depends why you're doing some of these things. And so the more we emphasize, I think, personal benefits like saving money, then actually maybe the less likely people are to do some of those political things, because they may not kind of join the dots and kind of see the relevance. But so there is something there about maybe not losing sight of climate change in some of the messaging. So yeah, it's not a natural thing, I think, or an inevitable thing that people will go on to lobby. So I think we have to if those are the behaviors we want to change, we have to target those behaviors specifically to get them to change.
And I think Donald's last part about focusing on individual behavior is a really good question for our group, because we traditionally focus on high-risk individuals or groups for behavior change in behavioral medicine. And the lore is that it was the big energy companies, the oil companies, that tried to coin the term, what is your personal carbon footprint, and try to focus on ourselves so that we wouldn't focus on them.
That's a really, really
is
good
that
point.
True? And how do you suggest we recalibrate the scope of our interventions?
I mean, I do think that's a really important point. The thing is, I think, we all need to change. So it is important that we change our behaviour, but also we do need businesses and government and everybody to change as well. In the work the deliberative work that we've done, for example, the UK Climate Assembly, which is a big citizens assembly on climate change, where we kind of looked at how people, a representative group of the UK public responded to different ideas around how to get to net zero and provided recommendations for policymakers. We found that it was really crucial that people felt that they were part of a collective effort, and that businesses and government and the public were all taking action, and that they definitely pushed back on the idea that it's individuals should be kind of doing a lot without this broader help. So I think it's really crucial that we do kind of highlight that what businesses are starting to do, where they are, but also obviously to put pressure on them to do more. And so there we can, we can definitely take various steps to push them, and we can, consume in different ways that then provides an economic argument for them to change, but we can lobby our politicians to in turn put pressure on businesses as well. So I do agree. I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. That's a really good point.
Wonderful. Thank you. One last question from Susie Honig. Susie Hong. Welcome, Susie.
Thank you, Alyssa. So I was thinking about more of a sort of in the context of health belief model of behavior change, and the perceived risk and how that may impact one's circumstances or health would really impact their behavioral change a lot. Now, in terms of climate change and planetary health, it seems like a general notion is that there isn't particularly perceived and acute impact on one's health. So I think it would be important, and I wanted to sort of pick your brain about how to strategize that. I'm asking that question because from a masking point of view for during COVID, the political leaning in the US seemed to have impacted and kind of targeting based on their sort of sentiment for the greater good as opposed to immediate risk for themselves made a difference based on their political leaning and impacted their masking behavior. So maybe next generation health or something like that kind of strategy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, I mostly talked about mitigation, which you can do really without believing in climate change, like in terms of behavior change. You can adopt a low carbon diet without any, motivation for doing that to tackle climate change. But adapting to the risks of climate change, then we definitely need to draw on that broader literature around kind of how to communicate risks effectively. And I think the health belief model is really a good example there, making those risks relevant to people. And they may be in terms of health impacts or financial impacts or kind of other sorts of things which would concern people. So again, sort of resonating with what people care about is really crucial, and making it seem much more local to them, because I think a lot of times people think this is a problem for somewhere far away. So we do need to kind of translate it into kind of meaningful, relevant risks for people. But also, and there was a great review by Linda Steg's group in the Netherlands, looking at what it is that predicts adaptation behaviours taken to adapt to climate change. And one of the headlines from that was that it's very little about knowledge. It's very little even about experiencing extreme events. It's much more about kind of trust and a sense of efficacy, like can what you do make a difference, as well as the sort of social context, like can you afford the measures, and various other sorts of more contextual factors. So that's quite interesting. And so I think, yeah, there's a role for communication, like raising awareness about these risks, but then there's other things as well that we need to do to actually change people's behavior and enable adaptation as well. So yeah, but I agree the political thing is really important as well, because those sorts of values will really play into what resonates with people.
Great. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. This was just a tease of some of the amazing behavior change work you've done, but it was a wonderful overview for us. And on our website, if you just even take Saunders and Lorraine's papers, you have a whole class, a whole seminar. It's just such a good introduction to this field, both the behaviors and attitudes. So Lorraine, if you're able to stay, there's some questions in the chat you might want to comment on. And just welcome to our community. You're such an important member, and we will you will see reverberations of your work, I believe, in our next generation and in some of us. Okay, I'd like to move to Sander van der Linden. I am so pleased that you could join us. He's on paternity leave, yet he is prioritizing this for us. He's a professor of social psych, Cambridge University in the UK. He is an international expert on climate, but also on really the general topic of attitudes, polarization, fake news, how to present scientific uncertainty. Such an important topic. He was obviously extremely popular during COVID. He was all over the news about attitude polarization. He's also the editor of the Journal of Environmental Psychology. Welcome, Sander.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction. Pleasure to be here. I'll go ahead and share my my screen. I should say that I know I've got 15 minutes, so I have to hone in on the key message here. So I won't talk about behavior change because, Lorraine's had an amazing presentation on how to change behavior. I think there is some value in examining people's beliefs and why people are polarized and what we can do about that, particularly in the intersection of misinformation and fake news. And it's kind of caught my attention at the moment, also because I have an interest in public health and vaccination decisions. And in fact, a lot of it is related. So as we know, in the United States, people are hugely polarized on the issue of climate change. So this is from Pew on whether or not climate change is human caused. It's similar for worry. You can see it's growing. Public opinion is becoming more supportive, but mostly for Democrats. You can see here that on the Republican side, it's been a hugely polarized issue for a long time. And it still is. Of course, the elite cues that were being sent from influential politicians weren't helping. Global warming created by the Chinese, big hoax, global warming hoax. And so that creates an environment that where people are polarized and their attitudes and beliefs become polarized. And that presents a roadblock for talking about solutions. I just gave a presentation in Sweden the other day where some of this is much less relevant because in Sweden everyone's on board with climate change and the conversation is what to do about it. Whereas I think in the United States we're often still stuck talking about, is it happening, is it real, or is it a hoax? And so we need to get over that. And more information. I think what's particularly interesting is the misinformation that plays into this can have real damaging consequences. You see this with COVID. Here in the UK, people have set phone masts on fire because of conspiracy theories linking 5G to COVID-19 symptoms. In Iran, people have died from ingesting methane. So I think it can have harmful consequences. And I think the same is true for misinformation about climate change. And I'll get to that in a second. There's a lot of work out there on what to do about the spread of misinformation about climate change. And there's been really two solutions, fact-checking and debunking. And as Lorraine was pointing out that, debunking and giving people better information only works to a certain extent. We know from cognitive science that there are limitations in how effective this can be. Debunking, which is the main tool that's used in public health and climate and environment and in other areas, it involves correcting something after it's already out there. And the huge challenge with this is, from a psychological point of view, is something that we call the continued influence of misinformation. Once you're exposed to a myth, once you've been exposed to a falsehood, it makes connections in your semantic memory networks, it makes friends, it connects to other things you know. What happens is that when people acknowledge a correction, they continue to retrieve false details from memory, even when they understand that there's been a correction. If you get food poisoning, let's say somebody tells you got food poisoning from a certain restaurant, even though it turns out it wasn't that restaurant. Every time you're going to walk by that restaurant, you're going to think food poisoning, even though it didn't happen. It's the same with misinformation. That's why it's so difficult to correct after the fact. I'm not saying that it's not useful. Fact checking is useful, but meta-analyses have shown that it's difficult to scale. Misinformation. The famous saying, right, that misinformation makes its way around the world while the truth is limping behind it, or it's still trying to get its pants on. That's the problem with fact checking. It just doesn't scale. There's so much more misinformation than you could ever correct, and that's why we have been focused on, in fact, a classic theory in social psychology that had long been forgotten that I think is very relevant here, and that's the theory of psychological inoculation, to try to inoculate people against misinformation, against attempts to polarize people, and essentially participate in the spread of misinformation. Now, we increasingly use models from epidemiology to see how fake news spreads. You can think of them as pathogens because you can use the exact same models from epidemiology to model how information contagions operate. And of course, if a community is vaccinated, the virus won't have a chance to spread. And we're trying to do the same thing here with the inoculation analogy. For those people not familiar with inoculation theory, it follows the vaccine analogy exactly. Just as you expose people to a weakened dose of a pathogen to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer immunity against future infection, it turns out you can do the same with information. And Bill McGuire, who was a famous social psychologist, showed this in the 60s. He was fascinated by prisoners of war in the United States, particularly the Korean War, and the 21 who decided to stay in the communist regime and never come back. And there was this big sort of psychiatric report on whether they were brainwashed and so on. And what he took away from that was whether there's actually a way to try to vaccinate people against brainwash attempts. And he never really tested it in any of these areas. It was sort of an idea that was tested in the lab on issues that were not very consequential. So we decided to take this idea and test it in the context of climate change as a starting point, just because it's so polarized in the United States. So the vaccine metaphor here is that you expose people to a weakened dose of the myth preemptively. This is the cognitive basis. It's also called a reputational preemption. We have retermed this into a prebunk because it's much easier to understand what a prebunk is. Instead of a debunk, you prebunk. So you preemptively refute misinformation for people. And you also warn people that there's going to be threats on their beliefs and attitudes in advance. Then over time, through internally rehearsing this, people build up psychological or intellectual antibodies and become more resistant. So I'll walk you through a study we did in the context of climate change to sort of illustrate this principle. Now, the media kind of termed this a fake news vaccine. I mean, it's sort of, you know, it's not entirely accurate. One journalist called us and asked if this was fake news. I mean, I think it's a fair question, but, you know, mostly there's value in the immunization metaphor, but obviously there are some deviations with the biological vaccine that I'm happy to get into. But I was very much inspired by Naomi Oreskes' book and subsequent documentary, Merchants of Doubt, which is brilliant. And it talks about the techniques that have been used to deceive people on the issue of climate change for decades by the big oil and tobacco industry also. In fact, it's the same techniques that were used by the tobacco industry that are now used by the fossil fuel industry to mislead people on the issue of climate change. And uncovering these techniques of manipulation has been really of interest to me, and then inoculate people against those techniques. And that's kind of what I've been working on the last few years. And a great example of this is a memo. This was a leaked memo to the Bush administration from Frank Luntz, who was a political strategist, who said, voters believe that there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. In a whole different line of research, we've shown that unfortunately this model is pretty good. When you expose people to the consensus about global warming, this influences other beliefs that people have, other attitudes, which in turn influences their support for policy. But likewise, when you decrease people's perception of scientific consensus, when you cast doubt on the scientific consensus, it makes people doubt the science, it lowers their support for public policy. And so what we wanted to do is see if we can inoculate people from these sort of misleading attempts. So we took a fact, a very simple fact, the scientific consensus on climate change, 97% of the scientists agree, something people could easily remember. And then we did a big survey, about 2,000 Americans, an experiment with different conditions, between conditions, and we measured people's prior judgment of agreement in the scientific community, their belief in climate change, and their posterior judgments after the manipulation. Also, people did know this was an experiment about climate change. We asked people to make estimates and judgments about lots of different popular issues to try to obscure the purpose of our survey. So if you show people the facts, what happens? Voila, they update their beliefs towards the facts. These are percentage points. So people increase their beliefs by 20 percentage points. They misperceive the consensus. Usually people think it's 50-50 because of a long-standing false media balance in reporting on climate change. But when you give people the right answer, they update, pretty much toward the right answer. Of course, you get critiques from people saying, look, this is not how it goes in the media. People they don't get factual information and then just update their beliefs. So in another condition, we exposed people to what's called the Global Warming Oregon Petition. This is a real website that was the basis of a viral story on social media that global warming is a hoax, and thousands of scientists that signed this petition saying global warming is a hoax. This is a real petition, by the way. Now, if you show people that, it has a negative impact on their attitudes. But what's shocking is when you model the fake news, the false balance that's often portrayed in the media of, oh, some scientists agree, but other people disagree. When you give people both cues at the same time, it completely neutralized the power of facts. So this big effect here was completely neutralized by the introduction of contrarian information. So our question was, can we inoculate people? Can we prevent this from happening? And so we had a partial vaccine and a full vaccine condition. The partial vaccine was a forewarning saying that there's political actors out there trying to mislead you on the issue of climate change, be aware. And the full vaccine was kind of the preemptive refutation. So a full kind of prebunk, which said, you may come across some petition trying to say that there's a lot of disagreement about climate change, but in fact, 30,000 is a super small number. If you look at US science graduates every year, it's like 0.01%. But also people on this petition include Charles Darwin, the Spice Girls, total bogus. And so that had a much bigger effect. And again, it's not a full immunity, but you can see here that about 1/3 and 2/3 of the effect, these are standardized effect sizes, were preserved by inoculating people beforehand. And what's really interesting about this study is that if you break this down by party affiliation or prior attitudes, it was a separate plot, but the result is the same, is that yes, if you show people two cues, if you don't believe in climate change, you're going to lean towards the cue that you already agreed with. But in the inoculation conditions, we see that the pattern is the same no matter what your party ID was. So, if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, everyone was inoculated, updating their beliefs towards the right position here. And maybe this is because nobody wants to be duped. Even, when you don't believe in climate change, you don't want to be misled because people have a very strong desire not to be manipulated. And so we found this quite helpful. Colleagues of mine, John Cook and Steve Lewandowski, replicated this experiment using the exact same materials. They even found bigger effects in how this can neutralize the effect of political ideology, so neutralize sort of politicization. We recently did a replication of it, delaying the misinformation attack. I'm not going to go through the whole experiment because it's pretty much the same as before. The only thing that's different here is a 1-week delay. So we attack people with the misinformation 1 week later, because I wanted to see if you inoculate people at time 0, are their attitudes still going to be resilient when you attack them 1 week later? And so at T1, you can see that in all conditions, people have only been shown the positive facts, right? And they update their beliefs, and there's nothing going on there except a positive change. But 1 week later, you can see that the inoculation prevents pretty much changes in attitude, negative changes in attitude compared to the false balance in the control group. And you pretty much preserve the effect that you would get from consensus alone without being exposed to the misinformation. And so it was pretty robust still 1 week later. So we got lots of questions from the media saying, okay, cool stuff, but how can you actually implement this? Do we want to pre-bunk every myth that's going to come out? How are you going to do this? And so I borrow a quote from my inspiration, Professor Severus Snape from the Harry Potter novels: "Your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the dark arts that you seek to undo." So what did we do? We decided to create a game. And so it's called Bad News. It's a simulated social media environment that allows people to learn about the techniques of manipulation at their own pace, in an environment that's more, quote unquote, ecologically valid in the sense that it mimics their behavior, and it's interactive, and people are forewarned about the dangers of fake news. But what's happening is they're stepping into the shoes of somebody who's trying to manipulate them and learning about the techniques, weakened doses, I should say, following the vaccine analogy, weakened doses of these techniques to gain resistance against them. So I'm going to show you some examples. This was during the Trump era. After long deliberation with my generals, I've decided to declare war on North Korea, hashtag Kim Jong-un. So you're impersonating Donald Trump here. This is called the impersonation technique, which is very prevalent in the health domain, impersonating fake experts, for example, with COVID cures. But you see here that we manipulated the Twitter handle of Donald Trump. Most people don't notice this at the beginning, but they notice it at the end. So you start floating stuff, you gain followers, and you can't be too ridiculous because then you lose all credibility. And so your aim is to gain as many followers as possible using the techniques of deception, weakened doses of them for a little bit. Mainstream media is a conspiracy, hashtag fake news, you're impersonating NASA, meteorite alert, large space objects set to hit US West Coast, hashtag be safe. You start trending and gaining followers. And here you can see, people respond to you. It's very interactive. You create your own echo chamber. You learn about polarization and how that works. And I just want to show you the climate module. So here you go and say, okay, well, I'm running my own news network now. I'm going to post this. Scientists, climate change should have serious negative impact on our way of life. Okay, let's attack this, because you're thinking about how do people attack science, and people get a taste of the medicine to inoculate themselves, right? And so, okay, it's a total hoax, very polarizing, should be easy to get people worked up over this. So how does this work? Let me float a meme. And so you're encouraged to float this meme. Scientists say climate is changing, but they can't even predict the rain. And so you get a reply from Kurt, who says, good point by the Cosmos Post, that's your newspaper, overconfident egghead scientist, hashtag climate hoax. And you see how this sort of works. And we walk people through polarization, impersonation, conspiracy theories, trolling, and emotion, and using emotions to manipulate people, and discrediting. And again, we're not teaching people new things. We're taking the existing techniques of deception. We create weakened doses of them, so ridiculous that nobody's actually going to believe it, right? So we're not duping people, but enough to trigger their defenses. And here's an example of how we test things. So Johnson crude oil. Hey, Leo DiCaprio, it's snowing and freezing in New York. Could use some of that global warming you're always going on about. So how reliable do you find this? We asked this pre and post gameplay, and now we want to, want people to understand that this is part of the trolling technique. So this is an oil company trolling Leonardo DiCaprio. And we've published these results recently with about 15,000 people in the initial evaluation of this intervention online. It was kind of in the wild, real intervention. So it was pre-post, it wasn't randomized. But you see that for real news, we're not making people more skeptical of real news. People find this credible before and after playing. But for the posts that used our manipulation techniques, people find it less reliable after playing the game. So they find fake news less reliable. This was true whether you were left-wing, right-wing, younger, older, lower educated. Yeah, there's some minor variation here that we can talk about, but overall it was pretty good. I'm not going to talk, I'm out of time, so I'm going to point you to some papers that these games also boost people's confidence in discerning fact from fiction. We've looked at the decay rate of the vaccination, so the long-term effectiveness of this, so we can model the function of the decay, and it does decay if you don't boost people in between. We've got lots of technical papers if people want to dive into this. We've got a number of reviews on this research program and how to counter misinformation through inoculation and prebunking. If you're interested, you can read more on that. John Cook, my colleague, has a fantastic game inspired by our work called Cranky Uncle, which teaches people about fallacious reasoning about climate change, very similar to bad news, but very much focused on climate change. We've done one on COVID-19 too. This is not relevant to climate change, but given the importance, we've done this with the UK government, and was the World Health Organization and the United Nations helped us distribute, go viral globally. We've also done one with the Department of Homeland Security on political misinformation in the US during the 2020 election. So we've got lots of evaluations of this in the field. And the last thing I'll say is that we're working with social media companies to try to implement this and really scale this. And one of the things we're doing is we're helping Facebook redesign their climate debunking hub. And so, Facebook is now taking a stand Yeah, no, it's a great question. So initially, when we launched, we had about 1 million people go through the intervention. So we got some good insight into who's participating, and obviously it tends to be more educated, liberal individuals. But what I'll say is that when we designed a game, first we did it in partnership with a gaming company, and to try to not make it a kind of liberal elitist educational intervention that would turn people off. The other thing is actually the game, we tried to make the game very non-political, which for science is a bit controversial. So in the game, people can make fun of climate change. You can make fun of the government. You can make fun of big pharma. We leave it up to people. And one of the reasons that we did this was to try to disarm preconceptions that people have. So people come into the game in a non-judgmental environment where they can learn about these techniques. So we're not telling people what the facts are. We're just exposing these techniques for people and leave it for people to decide. So unfortunately, we can't say that we're changing people's behavior, but we found that encourages uptake amongst more skeptical audiences because they can learn at their own pace and they're not being told what's true and what's fake. Having said that, I don't think that initially we were reaching, obviously, the conspiracy people and people who say that the mainstream media is fake news. One of the things we did was it went viral on Reddit. And so we were able to scrape all of the conversations on Reddit to see what's going on there. Unfortunately, it went viral on the science Reddit, not on the conspiracy subreddit. What we've learned from those lessons and the tons and tons of randomized sort of trials that we've done before we launched this is that we need help from people who know who the vulnerable audiences are, people who know who really needs the vaccine. We can do some testing as we did. We find that people who perform the worst on the pretest actually improve the most. So it is helping people. But of course, it's voluntary. It's opt-in. Not everyone's going to play a game. So what we found useful is that, for example, the World Health Organization was able to identify and target vaccine hesitant individuals and deliver the game to those individuals. The United Nations has a verified campaign, so they have information volunteers who can go around and try to implement this. But of course, some people are going to say that the WHO is fake news, that the UN is fake news. So there's going to be a limit to the types of audiences we can reach with this. So currently we're working with Google to try to do something else. Instead of a game, we're going to have 2-minute animated videos. And the idea is to launch them on YouTube, but to make it scalable. You know how YouTube has an ad space? So their algorithm can identify the probability that the video contains some harmful content, then they can insert the 2-minute pre-bunk in the ad space before people see the video, and they can scale that across all users so that it's not opt-in. So that's one of the ways that you can do that. Twitter on their own have done pre-bunking during the 2020 elections just by scaling the message across every Twitter users, regardless of whether they opt in or not. So those are some of the ways that people have tried, but you're absolutely right that the game is a voluntary opt-in intervention that's not going to reach everyone.
One very quick follow-up thought. I'm trying to think like somebody who's super skeptical, and maybe if it's framed as media are trying to trick you with both on the left and the right, kind of to feed in and agree that there is spin on media and to make you even more powerful to catch it. So the ones who believe in fake news in a way will, because like you said, it's not political and it can help them identify spin both on the left and the right and however you want to label things. So I can almost see it being marketed in a way that would extra appeal to the conspiracy theorists, depending how it's framed.
Yeah, the way that we marketed, that's right. We had lots of conversation about this, and I was a bit uncomfortable about it, but in the end, I think it was a good move. We did market it as, there's spin on the left and the right, and here's how you can identify it. This was very much the strategy that our partners wanted to take, and that I think that helped prevent it from becoming polarized. But I'm not sure if the diehard conspiracy theorists are really playing the game necessarily, but we're hoping to get there at some point.
Right. Thank you so much, Sandra. We have a couple minutes. I'll take the freedom of the last question. Is there, we want to kind of think out of the silos. Lorraine studies behavior change, you study attitudes. What, is there some kind of synergy between what you do? So if you looked at our behavior change interventions and you so deeply understand activation of climate attitudes and caring and how people can hear messages in a way that activates them, is there something that we should do in our interventions for attitude change to fuel the behavior change, to activate people even more?
Well, I think I would agree with what Lorraine said. It's very important to target target interventions based on people's values and their understanding of the world in order for them to be effective. But I often say this. I mean, there are two different goals. I mean, if you want to improve people's reasoning and depoliticize judgments and things like that, they're helpful interventions for that. But if you want to change people's behavior, I would actually do different things. I would go and target norms, or I would go and nudge people and change the environment and how people make decisions. I think there are shortcuts that you can take to change people's behavior much more directly that are more effective. And so, do some work in that area as well. And in fact, in this misinformation space, we've tried some of these things, and surprisingly, there's not always a sort of translation. So norms are an interesting example, because, for example, we've done some interventions where we show, oh, most people don't share fake news. And then we look at people sharing decisions. And they're not always influenced by normative information about what other people share online. Whereas with energy use behavior, for example, you see very normative effects, that if you say, oh, most people saving energy, people are more likely to then also save energy. And so it's interesting how that works. And I think, to answer your question, there is a common connection here, and that's like the what we call the normative beliefs or second order beliefs that people have. For example, I think social norm interventions are successful and interesting to everyone, but I think we often forget that they're successful because they're based on beliefs about what other people believe. And so it's the question of, if you think that everyone thinks that this is a common behavior, then that it's going to affect your behavior. But if you don't believe that, if you don't believe in the consensus, or if you don't believe the incidence rate of a given behavior, then you're not going to follow the norm. So I think the connection between beliefs and behavior can actually be quite useful to explore sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sander. This is, incredibly rich and important and relevant to so many of our current social issues and crises. I think what we'll do is shift to our part 2 now, which is, we have 2 of our US colleagues who are behavioral medicine scientists, many of us know, who are going to present the question, what do we do in our roles now? There's so much, Paul Hawkins says 2% of people work in sustainability. That's not enough. And many of us have day jobs that take up our bandwidth. So how do we move to this area? How do we be effective? How do we focus our energy? And, there's a lot of different ideas out there. So Sander and, Ed Maybach, who also studies attitudes, really focus on public will and political will and advocacy as the, pretty much the biggest levers of change. Other people focus on social norms, culture, behaviors as the way to change the well of public opinion and individual attitudes. And so how do you focus? How do you choose what you're going to focus on? So I'd like to introduce Julian Thayer and then Christy White, who are going to talk for a few minutes on how they're moving into this area and what they're doing. And so let me start with Julian. Julian, you have many hats, and I'm so happy that you're moving into this area of climate change. He has been on the Michael Diefenbach started a Society of Behavioral Medicine presidential working group on climate, which many of us have been part of, many of us here, and Lorraine joined us for that as well. And so our sub working group is on health disparities, and Julian and Christy are both in that. And he's going to talk for a few minutes about how we think about how we must take into account the systemic racism in the climate crisis. Julian, welcome.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. I hope you all can see this.
Yep.
So I want to just talk for a few minutes and by way of kind of a case study. And the case study I want to talk about is Hurricane Katrina. And Robert Bullard, who is considered one of the fathers, so to speak, of environmental racism, has written a book about this, Race, Place, and Environmental Justice After Hurricane Katrina. Spike Lee did a movie about it. So this is something that we're a bit familiar with. So just for those of you that are a little bit unfamiliar, the historic lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans was particularly hard hit by Hurricane Katrina. And this is a marker that has been put up on August 29, 2005 at about 7:45 a.m. The industrial channel flood wall broke. Now, this industrial channel is interesting. I'll show you this in a minute. With an explosive sound heard by many residents near North Johnson Street and Jourdain Avenue. At that time, the lower Ninth Ward was home to some 3,400 families, over 50% homeowners. Isolated by man-made structures and by water, this proud neighborhood had long been a place where people of color could thrive economically by transferring home ownership from one generation to the next. Over the next decade, many struggled to rebuild, often with the help of volunteers. So what I want to say at this point is that the effects of climate change and things like increasing hurricane frequency and severity, racism amplifies these effects. And so this is a figure of New Orleans, a map, and this shows the lower Ninth Ward. And here's this industrial channel, the Mississippi River. The access into and out of the Ninth Ward is extremely limited, so that they could not even evacuate. And just to give you an image, so this is before, and this is soon thereafter. And you can see it's just completely inundated because this barrier, this industrial channel, the levee broke and water overflowed and just completely inundated the neighborhood. And this is another image where you can see before and after. You know, the devastation was incredible. I was part of a group of architects and scientists that went to New Orleans soon after the waters had receded to assess the situation and talk about what we could do. And one of the things that took place was there were not a whole lot of people of color involved in this particular initiative. And I got a taxi ride by a Ninth Ward resident through the area. And I saw some of the devastation, including, you know, these houses that were thrown on top of vehicles, and, you know, just the absolute devastation that took place. And a 2015 paper from the Middle States geographer talks about this lower Ninth Ward and the recovery and rebuild. So this is about 10 years afterwards. And what they conclude, I think, is very interesting. So more than 40 of the city's 72 neighborhoods were flooded during Katrina, many with more than 10 feet of water. So the lower Ninth Ward was approximately 14 feet below sea level. So that's by design. So they were, this minority community was isolated into this area. All told, over 100,000 New Orleans homes were flooded, more than 26,000 sustained wind damage. 10 years after Katrina, more than 40 of New Orleans' 72 neighborhoods were recovered, over 90% of the population they had before the levees failed. Only 4 neighborhoods had less than half the population they had prior to Katrina. The ward is one of those 4 neighborhoods. 3 of these neighborhoods had public housing sites that had been demolished to make way for new mixed income housing, with the idea of increasing populations of these areas. One of the interesting things is that Brad Pitt had an initiative to build houses in this area, and it's a mixed blessing, let's say. Only the ward is not scheduled for public housing. At its current growth rate, it will take decades before the ward recovers to its pre-Katrina population and housing levels. And the conclusion continues, and I highlighted a particular section. The Black population was 97% prior to Katrina, and now it is estimated to be approximately 60%, indicating that whitening has occurred. What this means is that after these disasters, gentrification takes place, and this is again part of what Brad Pitt's well-intended efforts might have led to. So the question is, what can we as behavioral medicine scientists do. So with my colleague Jos Broskov, we published some papers on an idea called the generalized unsafety theory of stress, talking about the default stress response. And the idea is that this default response to unsafety is the fight or flight response. This will show itself in elevated baseline levels, not necessarily in exaggerated reactivity. And safety has to be explicitly recognized, either consciously or most likely unconsciously, to turn off the stress response. And this, from our perspective as researchers, shifts stress theory from a focus to threat to a focus on safety. Now, this is very reminiscent of Steve Maddox's previously enunciated prevailing state model that did not get as much traction as I'm sure Steve would have liked, but it shows that it is this prevailing state that may be most important. And of course, I've been greatly influenced by our colleague Tika Hall, who considers sleep as a pillar of health. So this sleep period is another interesting thing that we can do as researchers to study this. So if our stress responses are prolonged during sleep, then this may be a major mediator of the relationship between stressors and unfair treatment associated with discrimination and systemic racism to organic disease. And this is a paper that was published in 2018 from Andy Sherwood and on dipping and non-dipping. And I just want to highlight one thing here, which is that the total peripheral resistance of Blacks during sleep is equivalent to the total peripheral resistance of whites when they're awake. So this period of rest and restoration that should be taking place is not taking place, and many of us think that this is a result of structural racism and that it amplifies these effects of climate change. So I just want to close by showing you the weather map from last night. So this storm is headed towards New Orleans. I haven't looked this morning to see. This same area is under a tropical storm warning and a flood watch. So even with all of our efforts to rebuild, which will be taking decades, this is an ongoing problem. You may think that Hurricane Katrina is over and done with, but the issues involved remain. So with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian. We'll have some time for a Q&A with Julian and Christy after Christy's talk. Very powerful, very relevant, and bringing in the research we all love and know about understanding stress calibration is just so brings it all home for all of our research. Okay, so let me have the pleasure of introducing Christy White, who is, despite her being significantly younger than me, is one of my mentors in learning about climate and what we can do in advocacy. She is a health psychologist at the Hennepin Healthcare in Minnesota. It has been a very intense year. Her healthcare system is where George Floyd's body ended up after he was murdered. So it's a very tense city, and she is an advocate for BIPOC community, and her climate passion has lasted from graduate school till now. She's the chair of the new APS Special Interest Group for Climate Change, and she has influenced climate change in her own state in Minnesota. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you. Let me share my screen and my slides here. Okay, I see Adrian in my window. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen without the presenter notes? Okay, excellent, thank you. So thank you everyone for being here today and choosing to spend your time in community with us around addressing climate change. It's a real honor to be on this esteemed panel with such prominent leaders in this area, and I really appreciate the very generous introduction, Alyssa. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time to share with you all some of my experience as a climate advocate within my healthcare system. I've always been an environmentalist at heart. I was on litter patrol in elementary school, and The Lorax was one of my favorite books as a kid. But it wasn't really until my second year of graduate school that it occurred to me how to merge my environmental and academic and clinical interests. So I was working toward my PhD with a background in stress, cardiovascular psychophysiology, and cardiometabolic disease. And it struck me that as someone who is developing expertise in health behavior change, I had a unique role to play in addressing climate change, given that it's a human behavior-driven problem. So we can kind of think about climate change as a collective health behavior, but more on a planetary scale. And so now, as Alyssa mentioned, I'm currently working as a board certified clinical health psychologist in primary care within a safety net hospital system here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My job is 100% clinical, so most of the scientific work I do comes from the angle of applying, disseminating, and implementing behavioral science in a clinical setting. And so everything I'm about to share with you about how I've been involved in climate advocacy is within the context of this as my current job and background. And so my hope is that by the end of this discussion, getting involved in climate change advocacy will feel a bit more accessible to you all within your own institutions. So I just have a couple of questions for you all to reflect on for a moment here. The first is, which of the following best describes what you are currently doing to address the climate crisis? And then the second question is, which of the following best describes your interest in using your research or advocacy to address the climate crisis? And so regardless of what answers you give, my hope is that the information I share with you will be useful to you regardless of where you fall on the continuum. And so here is just a small sampling of some of the things that I've done to advocate for climate health within my healthcare system and within the organizations that I'm involved in. So installing a community garden at one of the clinics where I work, leveraging my role as the programs and education chair of our sustainability committee and using that role to encourage my hospital to sponsor and support a climate change related conference within the local system. So you see our little logo there. Serving as a content expert on our county's climate action plan and providing some content expertise on how we can incorporate climate justice into our local climate action plan. Sometimes the marketing and PR department comes to me and asks for feedback or information about newsworthy topics. And so recently I was asked to provide some information about how heat is impacting our health and well-being. And one of the things that I really make it a practice of doing is normalizing talking about climate change with all of the work that I do. So not only providing education, but talking about how this is occurring within the context of climate change. And then also using my role as a member of the governing council of the Minnesota Psychological Association to sign on to a Minnesota Declaration on Climate Change and Health. And then as Alyssa recently mentioned, working with some colleagues within the American Psychosomatic Society to create a climate change, sustainability, and health special interest group. So those of us who are members of that organization can pool our shared interests to get involved in this area. And so that's all great. Everyone is really busy. How can we actually do this, right? Because we all have really busy day jobs, as Alyssa mentioned before. And so this picture comes from my daughter, and this is her vision of me as a green superhero. And this got me thinking that we all have our own superpowers that we can offer. So for example, someone who has the network matchmaker superpower is our friend and colleague who's on this meeting today, Dr. Eric Prather, whom I met for the first time at a conference a couple of years ago. And after sharing my area of interest with him and lamenting the fact that I've been searching for other health psychologists who are doing this work for over 10 years to no avail, he said, well, actually, I know someone. And he clued me into how our very own Alyssa Epple has been doing this work. And I had been a fan of hers for some time, but I had no idea that she was interested in this area. So I mustered up enough courage to reach out to her and ask if she would be interested in forming a partnership to combine our shared interests. And the results have been incredibly rewarding. And she is also an example of someone with mentorship, amplification, and inspiration superpowers. So never underestimate the potential impact of your influence. And so here's a resource that I want to end with from Healthcare Without Harm about how to get started as a health professional advocate for climate policy solutions. I've personally found this to be very helpful, and the content is really applicable for institutions outside of healthcare as well, like universities, government organizations, and others. So for those of you who are interested in learning and doing more, I highly recommend using this resource as a starting point. And so with that, I would like to open it up to the broader discussion. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you so much, Christy. Such inspiring and impressive work. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes for group discussion, and you can just raise, just raise your hand. Can I see everyone? And also would love to see your faces. I have to say that's part of the thrill of all of us being together in this weird virtual world. And we will be together, many of us in person in October. I just so much look forward to that. We'll continue the theme of climate. Okay, any hands raised? What are you guys going to do, if anything? I love the questions, Christy. You know, I feel like, well, there's a lot of social desirability, though, in those answers. And honestly, most of us are concerned, but don't know exactly what to do. I'll say that I have tremendous climate distress, and we're in a heat wave. We're going to be in smoke soon, and it's only going to get worse. And you know, it's a huge emotion regulation challenge. How do we view the future? We need to view a positive future to stay motivated and work for change. We need to think that we matter as individuals. And so I have really grasped and adhered models of how social change works, how social quantum change works, how you influence people and they influence people. And now we have social media to carry it across globally. Susan Chakowski talked about we need a movement like the smoking public health campaign. And I'd like to ask you, Susan, because you're working on policy. I agree with you that we have some good models of social change, and they take too long. 10 years at a minimum for one of these huge public health campaigns. How are we going to do this with climate? We don't have 10 years.
Yeah, you know, I don't know what to say, Alyssa. I think it does take a long time. I think it's critical to as folks have been talking about, the speakers and folks here, to look at this as a multi-level phenomenon. So our individual personal behavior, affecting policy, all of that is important. I think we just, I thought the talks were absolutely brilliant, and I love these two talks as well, Julian and Christy, for bringing it home and making it so personal to all of us, and the previous talks, bringing so much good data to bear. I can only say that NCI and NIH are really activated on this issue, and there are just multiple groups going on that are examining this. I'm the member of a couple of them at NCI that are thinking about initiatives, and other groups across NIH, and it is just a moment. And if you think about it, yes, change in the tobacco control area took many years. It did. But look at the difference it's made in terms of all the way from policy through to individual behavior change. We're not, there yet, but lives have been saved. I mean, it has made incredible impact, the work that was done over many years at all levels. And so I can only say, you know, it may take a long time, but I think we have to engage in it. And, you know, NIH and the NCI are doing that. So
Yeah.
Stay tuned. There's going to be
Susan, thank you so much.
action.
You and your NIH colleagues are so important here. We couldn't do this without you, and you have so
Right.
much on your plate, and you're blazing forward on this. So it's
Oh,
amazing.
well,
I
thank
think
you.
the change will happen sooner.
I
It's a different
want to
world,
thank
you know.
you, Alyssa, and everybody here for their interest, and thank you for organizing this, and to the speakers. It's been
Well, you know,
brilliant.
let's keep in touch with what we're doing in classes and measures and activating young researchers. I think that we all have, you know, similar intentions, and we can really support and fuel each other. So with that, I think
Redford has a question. His hand's raised.
Thank you, Red.
Yeah, very quickly, should our interest in making the climate problem come under better control influence our political affiliations and donations money-wise to certain political groups?
And who is the question to, Donald? I mean, Redford?
Anybody who wants to vote for the Republicans.
Is the Pope Catholic?
But it is I guess I'm making a comment. It is very clear that our two parties, one is very much like Joe Biden's, you know, really been lobbying and talking about the climate issue, and we got to do something about it.
So I'm not going to weigh in here except to say that this is a major priority of the current administration.
Yes, thank you.
Can I make a comment on that, Alyssa?
Yes.
So I think you bring up a really good point in terms of thinking about how we spend our money, right? And even progressive organizations can take a look at investment and divestment opportunities. So for example, where do we bank as an organization? Do we have investments in companies that have historically engaged in predatory lending practices, or who fund big oil or you know, other climate change perpetuating organizations? And so even if we're you know, not necessarily swaying people to change their political affiliation, how we conduct ourselves as professionals within our organizations is also a really big target for making some of these changes. So you bring up a good point.
I think we need to realize that our research is not in a vacuum. If we want real change, we need to acknowledge the evil forces, political forces, the greed behind them, and try to take them into account in our research and not be, I mean, I think I've been naive and Pollyanna-ish and, you know, not wanting to be political, and that, you know, that's just going to be game over for us. I really appreciate all of your time. I love you all. I look at your faces. I'm so happy we have this community and where we're going. And I want to end with Tika. All of us who were on the call with her were so deeply rocked by the fragility of life, by her positive attitude of, I want people to look at me and say, I'm a person who lived a really short, had a really, you know, a short life, shorter life than expected, but was happy and did meaningful work and have no regrets in life. And it was so meaningful for her to know that she would have a legacy through her mentoring and through the awards. And we all have such short time. We don't know when it is over, and we do meaningful work. And I think just moving together and not being silos and working together is, you know, is beautiful and where we need to go. And so I appreciate you all, and I'll just want to end with that. And if you want to see, I did link to the Tika page. I think that that it's, you know, it's just a reminder to me. I feel so much meaning and purpose when I work on climate, and I am doing more kind of convening and advocacy than basic research, even though the research is exciting and fun. It takes a long time. So I'm not quite sure what I'm doing yet, but I can tell you it's a little bit more along the lines of Christy White. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you in October.
Thank you so much, Alyssa.